I want to start by thanking every one of you who decided to sign up for membership on this channel. I really appreciate you all. So this is the supplemental video where I'm going to try and fill in the gaps on the whole my workflow and how it is that I graded this image. And I'm going to go step by step so that you guys have a better understanding. I know some of the comments had to do with the order of nodes, and I think it's important that I fill in those gaps for you all so you have a better understanding of what it is that I'm doing and where it is that I'm making these adjustments. So what I always like to do, this is my file as it came in, right? I just turned off all the effects. So what I like to do is I like to leave a node empty. I then add another node. And in this node is where I make my exposure adjustments. And I add a third node, which is where I do my initial LUT that gets me into the color space that I'm going to be working in. Color transforms work similar. As I understand it, color transforms are not destructive, which may be a better workflow for some people. For me, this is what is working, and I'm not saying everybody should do exactly the way that I do things. But this works for me, and the reason why it works for me, I'm going to show you. In fact, I'm going to add a node. I'm going to add a parallel node just to show you what the difference is. So if basically I'm at step 3, I haven't done any corrections or any work done yet in my workflow, right? So I have 3 nodes up, 1, 2, and 3, and in this case, a parallel one, because I'm going to show you the differences. So if in number 3, or the third node, is where I make my first correction, and my first correction, as I said in the video, is where I add a LUT. So if I go LUTs, and I'm going to do Canon log 2 video. No, these are the resolve ones. So I need my actual Canon LUTs. Here we go, Canon C log LUTs. So this is the folder that I imported from the download that is available on the Canon website. And I'm going to go with a 3D LUT. This is 10-bit. So 17 grid is for 8-bit, 33 grid is for 10-bit, and 65 grid is for 12-bit. So I'm going to go 33 grid, full to full range, okay? And then I know that I shot this in Cinema Gamut, Canon log 2, so this is where I'm going to start. And now I need to decide what do I want it to turn into, right? Or what do I want to deliver to? So I'm going to go BT709 wide DR, and I'm going to apply it. And this is Canon's LUT, which I think looks really nice, really nice. On my monitor, you know, it works. Now I'm going to compare it to the LUT that I actually used. And this is the LUT that I used. And the reason why I like this LUT personally is because this LUT works well across my C500 Mark II, as well as my Canon EOS R5, and now the Canon C70. And this LUT specifically is one that I created. So it's this MediaIQ C500 Mark II web delivery. And that's the reason why I went with this LUT. But obviously, the Canon provided LUT does a really good job. So with that, because this is not the way that I work, I'm going to delete this parallel node. Whoops, I deleted the wrong one. Okay, so if I have 3 nodes in my workflow done so far, this is my first adjustment. Now, I right away will go to the Waveform Monitor, and I do have the extends turned on so that I can make sure that I am not crushing or blowing out any highlights, or blowing out highlights, crushing dark areas. And I then, on my second node, so the node before where I apply the LUT is where I make my exposure and contrast adjustments. So node number 3, LUT. Node number 2, which is one before that, exposure and contrast adjustments. Now, for my next node, and you notice node number 1 is still empty. And the reason why node number 1, I generally had a node number 1 in my workflow is because I've been shooting on red for a number of years, and node number 1 for me has always been about denoising. So if I needed to apply noise reduction, this is where I would apply it. So this is now going to lead me into another comment and topic that's come up on the YouTube video that I released, where I was going through the workflow. People are commenting about this and calling it chromatic aberration, this area and here, and then on this other edge and these other edges. I'm going to tell you that it's not chromatic aberration, and you're going to have to take my word for it, because what this is actually doing is the focal plane ends at about here, and then it begins to drop off. So all of this is already bokeh, right? So it's not in focus on purpose because of how shallow I was shooting. Because right behind her is a garbage can, and I didn't want to see it. Also, the sun is coming in from behind, so it's backlighting everything, which is the reason why some of these edges are more accentuated. So fear not, it's not the camera and it's not the lens. It is the exact situation, and then also the depth of field that I chose. If in fact we were getting chromatic aberration, we would see it all on the fringes of her hair, which we don't. And I'll blow this up so that you can see we don't have it. We have it on these edges that are being hit from behind on the light because of what's in the background that is out of focus. Okay. Now, for my next node, so once I'm happy with the LUT that I applied, or the color transform that I applied, or whatever I'm doing to make sure that I'm working in Rec 709 space, and I adjust my exposure and my contrast to make sure that I'm taking as much as I can of the dynamic range out of the image, I then add another node, and this is where I focus on skin. And you notice what I did is I reduced the contrast just a tad. I increased the exposure just a bit. And the main reason is, this looks a little grainier. This looks much more pleasing. And as I mentioned, because I work with people and people like to look at themselves in video, then it's my job to make them look as best as they possibly can. And with some of these digital cameras these days, they are so sharp that they bring out every single piece and layer out of a skin that sometimes may not be flattering. Now, what I want you to notice is that even though I did this, there is still texture. Like I didn't remove like her wrinkles or her features or anything. All I did was smooth them out just a tad so that they were not so sharp. Okay. Once I'm happy here, I then work on additional saturation. And this is in an attempt, I should show you the waveform, not the waveform, the vector scope. And all I'm doing is I'm increasing the saturation so that she begins to pop a little bit more. And the way that I do saturation adjustments is, excuse me, I come into the RGB mixer and then I increase all the outputs to 100%. You'll see that. Now that I'm on the correct node, all the outputs are at 100%, and then I go into the key and then I dial it back down. So I'm at 3.25, but if this was too much for you, we could bring it down to, I don't know, let's say, she begins to get orangey if I do that. Let's go with 300. So this looks pleasing. She's already popping more than her surroundings. I'm headed in a good direction. And of course, my color contrast is taking shape. And what I mean by color contrast, of course, is I'm pulling in both directions opposite of the color wheel. All right, in my next node, I did a skin qualification, right? So you can see it here in my key, or if I turn this on, you can see what I did. But basically, what I'm doing here is I'm furthering and tinting the dark areas of the image. So once I qualified for her skin tones, I inverted the qualification. See, so this is what I started with. I inverted it, and now anything that was dark, I then made an offset adjustment to pull it into the cyan to give it that extra bit of color contrast. You can see here, it's like the railing and stuff behind her on the steps where she's sitting is kind of flat. But if I turn on that adjustment, then you can see the cyan that was introduced. And that, of course, continues to play into the opposite end of the color spectrum and adding color contrast. In the next node, I then made one additional exposure adjustment so that it wouldn't be so dark, right? So I needed to increase the exposure, and I did that here. And this, of course, now begins to create more depth and separation in the image because our foreground is lighter than our background, even though our background is really full sun that is being, lighting up the entire street on the background. In the next image, I then am once again creating more drama by creating a bigger separation between the highlight areas of the image and what should be or darker in the image. So I'm framing my subject using a power window. And this is my power window that I chose to use and how it is that it's shaping out into this particular shot. Now, once I'm happy and satisfied with this, and of course you could extend it or shrink it depending on whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. Once I'm happy here, then my next adjustment is again about refining the face. And this is where I said I use face refinement. And if I show you what I did here, you can see I left this texture piece alone. And I did eye retouching. And you can see that I did a little bit of eye bag removal and I did highlight. And it's very subtle, but it does make a difference. Just to help, bring that up a bit. And I also did a little bit of sharpening on her actual eyes. And I think that helps bring the image and make the image pop a little bit more. Show you in full screen. So it's subtle, but it's there. And we didn't lose texture. That's the other important piece, right? Like we don't want people to look like plastic. So that is that adjustment. And then I mentioned that I was basically almost done. I just needed to clean up the shadows and add film grain. Well, I'm going to add one other adjustment here at a serial node. This is something I didn't do in the video, but it's something we certainly can do. And I got questions regarding sharpening. So for sharpening, we're going to go into this blur tool. And this is my favorite way of sharpening an image. And instead of using blur, I'm going to use mist. And what mist does specifically is that it works similar to like a black pro mist filter. So if things are supposed to be sharp, then they're going to be sharp. And if they're not supposed to be sharp, then it will work on giving them a bit more softness. But what this will also do is it'll help us get a little bit sharper face without like destroying the image. So just so you guys can see what is happening here, I'm going to exaggerate. I'm going to say, let's say we go all the way to 40 here. So down is sharpening, up is blurring, in case you guys are wondering. I'm going to do the same thing for the radius. And you can see here, obviously that's way too sharp, right? That is too sharp. And we could certainly go into the key and just reduce that to taste. That's one way of doing it. Or what I prefer to do, instead of doing multiple tools to make the same adjustment, is just back it up. So I'm going to reset these. And I'm going to start with HV ratio because that will give me an idea of where my radius should be. And typically between 48 and 47 on skin looks actually really nice. And watch now, it'll finish the effect here when I add the radius. And that to me looks sharper and it does look nice. Of course, if you're working with people that are a lot older, then you might want to skip this step, which is one of the main reasons why I generally skip this step. And then I'm going to desaturate my shadows, and let's take a look at the actual waveform. This is how I desaturated my shadows. So if I turn that on, now I'm not getting, check this out. So you see this area around her neck where we can see some noise pollution in here. And that's because, you know, her skin is reflecting, then also my saturation adjustments and so on and so forth. If I desaturate the shadows, then it cleans all of that up. And that's why it's really important. It's not just about blacks, but it's about any other areas that have gradients. And of course, you can make this adjustment, you know, to whatever it is that looks right for you. But I think that adjustment just took care of the pollution that we were seeing here on the side. And then, of course, the final thing is to add film grain. And that just gives it an extra bit of texture to the actual image. In my film grain settings, I always use 35 millimeter. I always leave the opacity at 50 or 0.5, so 50%. And I never really mess with this, but I always do go from whatever the default is to 35 millimeter, and I don't really do the others. Some of the others to me are a little bit more aggressive. So this is what I find works best for my taste, and that's what produces the final image. So again, I just want to thank every single one of you for deciding to become members of the channel. You guys are rock stars and really what motivates me to keep going. Until next time, I'm Carlos, and I will catch you guys in the comments. Take care.